In the small town of Elmsville, where everyone knew everyone, there lived a girl named Emily and a boy named Zach. Their homes stood side by side, and they grew together, but from the beginning their relationship was far from perfect. Emily was a quiet dreamer who loved to draw and read books about distant countries. Zach was a restless mischief, always looking for adventures and new antics. Even in kindergarten, Zach repeatedly pulled Emily by the pigtails to attract her attention. And in return, she gave him the worst pencil in his hands when all the children painted. Their confrontation turned into a kind of game in which everyone tried to take over. In elementary school, Zach once replaced Emily with her favorite peanut butter sandwich with a piece of bread with wasabi paste, which almost made the girl cry from the burning. In response, she threw his sports uniform into the washing machine with her red t-shirt, and his white uniform became pink for the whole season. Years passed, and their war of jokes continued. They never had peace from each other. But over time, everything began to change. One day, when they were both 16, something happened. Emily returned home from school, and when she happened to meet Zach in the yard, she noticed something strange. He grew up, his former boyish appearance changed to something more adult. And although she dismissed this thought, something flashed in her heart that she could not understand. Zach, in turn, also began to notice the changes. Emily no longer seemed the same girl he liked to compete with. Her dark brown hair looked good in the sun, and the smile she sometimes tried to mock at suddenly didn't seem so evil. But his pride and habit of their ancient war prevented him from changing something. One evening at school night, Zach saw one of the high school boys approaching Emily. His name was Lucas, and he was one of the most popular at school. Zach suddenly felt a wave of jealousy growing in his chest. He didn't even understand why himself, but decided that he wouldn't let this Lucas just take away all Emily's attention. Zach, approaching the company where Emily was standing, pretended that it was completely accidental. "Oh, Emily," he said with a smile that could make her angry at any moment. "I completely forgot to thank you for the wonderful cake you brought to the cooking class." I think everyone felt this unforgettable taste of salt instead of sugar. Emily raised an eyebrow, realizing that Zach decided to provoke her just now when she was talking to Lucas. "And I just wanted to thank you, Zach, for washing the paint from the bench so skillfully after our last incident. She must have held up very well." Lucas obviously didn't know about their long-standing wars, and the awkwardness in the air became noticeable. Zach, feeling that his jealousy was growing more and more, decided to act directly. "Emily, can I have you for a minute?" he asked, leaving Lucas surprised. Without waiting for the answer, Zach had already taken her hand and pulled her towards the exit. "What are you doing?" Emily whispered irritably as they found themselves in the quiet corridor of the school. "I'm saving you from this pretentious popular guy," Zach replied, trying to hide his nervousness behind his usual audacious smile. "So you think I need salvation?" She crossed her arms on her chest, looking at him with a challenge. Zach was silent for a few seconds, trying to find the right words. "Emily, I don't know why, but when I see you next to someone else, it infuriates me," he finally blurted out. "And I don't understand why I feel it." Emily frozen. She didn't expect such sincerity from him. She always saw in him only a rival who could ruin any of her days. But these words made her think. "Zach, are you really serious now?" she asked, looking at him suspiciously. Seriously," he replied, and his voice was already less confident. For a moment, there was silence between them, and they just looked at each other. Now Emily felt something strange. It became difficult for her to breathe, her heart was beating faster. "It doesn't change the fact that you're unbearable," she whispered. "And you're the same," Zach smiled, but there was more than just a joke in his eyes. Emily, without waiting for an answer, turned around and walked away from the corridor. But Zach's words were spinning in her head. Something changed, and although she tried to ignore it, the truth was obvious. She could no longer look at him as she used to. The next few days there was silence between them. Emily focused on her school projects, trying to displace thoughts about Zach. But one evening, when she was working on a drawing in her room, a pebble suddenly knocked on the window. She shuddered and came closer. On the street, Zach stood with a flashlight pointing directly into her window. "Are you crazy?" she shouted irritably, opening the window. "It's even too much for you. Emily, just come out for a minute." "It's important," he said seriously. She hesitated a little, but something in his voice made her throw her jacket down and go down. When she went out into the yard, she saw Zach with a bicycle. "What kind of circus is this?" she asked, folding her hands on her chest. "Sit down," he said. "Sit down? On your bike?" "No means," she laughed. "Just trust me," he insisted. Emily, not knowing why, obeyed. She got on the bike and Zach started pedaling. They were driving through the quiet streets of the city at night, and Emily suddenly felt the wind dispelling her hair. She didn't remember the last time she felt so free. Finally, they stopped on a hill, which opened a view of the entire city. Zach took a blanket out of his backpack and spread it out on the grass. "What is it?" Emily asked, looking at him suspiciously. "Just sit down," he replied. They sat on the quilt, and Zach pulled out a small pocket projector from his pocket. He turned it on, and an image of their childhood photos appeared on the nearest tree. "What is it?" she asked in surprise. "I finally decided to apologize for all those years. And at the same time, thank you for always being there, even if it looked like an eternal struggle," he said, and there was more sincerity in his voice than Emily had ever heard from him. She couldn't help but tears appeared in her eyes. "Zach, Don't say anything," he interrupted. "Just know that, despite everything, I'm glad you were there. And I want you to know that I'm not going to waste any more time on nonsense." A star flashed in the sky. Emily looked up, and at the same moment, Zach took her hand. That moment was different. It was more than reconciliation. It was the beginning of something new that they were both afraid to admit, but could no longer ignore. After that night, everything changed. Emily and Zach no longer avoided each other, but their new dynamics were filled with awkwardness and hints of something more. Their former battles gave way to long glances and random touches, which each of them tried to ignore. One day, Emily, walking through the park, saw Zach. He sat on a bench with a guitar, calmly playing a melody. She knew that Zach had always been musical, but she had never seen him so focused. She came closer and sat down next to her. "I didn't know you were playing the guitar," she said, breaking the silence. Zach raised his head and smiled. "You don't know much about me, Emily," he replied, a little thoughtfully. "Oh, right. For example?" She tried to sound lightly, but her heart pounded inside. He looked at her, and this look was long and filled with something she couldn't understand. "For example, that I wrote this melody thinking of you," he said unexpectedly, causing Emily to freeze in place. "About me?" Her voice trembled a little. "Yes. About how you always remain yourself, even when the whole world is trying to change you. About how your laugh, even when it's directed against me, makes me feel alive. And about how I always find a reason to be next to you, even if I don't admit it." He shrugged his shoulders as if it were something common. Emily felt her cheeks flare up. She never imagined that Zach was capable of such words. "It's unfair," she said softly. "What exactly?" he asked, looking at her carefully. "The fact that you suddenly make me feel different. The fact that you stopped being just a rival, and I don't know what to do about it." She looked down, trying to hide her emotions. Zach gently took her hand. "Maybe you don't need to know. Maybe just let it be." His voice was warm and calm, and she felt the anxiety gradually disappear. They sat in silence, only the wind rustled in the tree crowns. At that moment, they no longer needed words. It was the first real moment when they allowed themselves to be themselves, without jokes, competitions and protective barriers. But that was just the beginning of their journey. The next day, Emily was in for a surprise that turned her life upside down even more. She received an invitation to participate in an art competition in New York. It was her dream, but the trip meant that she would have to leave the town and maybe Zach. She didn't know how to tell him about it, but she knew she couldn't do it without emotion. Emily sat in her room, reviewing the invitation letter. It was a chance of her life, a competition that could open the door to a professional career as an artist. But the thought that she would have to leave her town, and most importantly, Zach, made this decision incredibly difficult. Zach, unsuspectingly, came to her house that evening. He knocked on the door while holding a box of pizza in his hands, his favorite way to make Emily spend time with him. "Hey, artist, I thought you must be hungry," he said, breaking into the room without an invitation. His smile was so sincere that for a moment Emily wanted to forget about everything and just enjoy his company. "Zach, I have serious news," she said, trying to stay calm. "Don't say you're planning something with paints and my bike again," he joked as he sat on her bed. Emily exhaled and handed him a letter. Zach took it, read it, and was silent for a few seconds. "New York," he finally said, and his voice was slightly sad. "It's incredible. Emily, this is your chance." "I know, but," she stopped, not knowing how to express her thoughts correctly. "I'm afraid." "What are you afraid of?" He looked at her, seriously and attentively. "All of it. It is a huge city, new people. And also, I'm afraid to leave this place." "Leave you?" she said, looking at the floor. Zach was silent for a moment. He came closer, sat down next to him and took her hand in his. "Emily, you have to go. If it's your dream, you can't let anything, not even me, stop you," he said, trying to hide the pain he felt at that moment. "But I don't want to lose what we have now." She looked at him, her eyes shining with tears. "You won't lose anything," Zach replied. "Between us, it doesn't depend on distance. And if it's real, we'll find a way." Emily nodded, but her heart was heavy. In the following days, preparations for the trip took up all her time. Zach, as usual, was there, helping to pack her things and even drawing humorous notes on boxes. On the last night before leaving, they sat on the same hill where they first realized their feelings. "I want you to take something with you," said Zach, taking out of his pocket a small bracelet with engraved letters ZNE. "What is it?" she asked, looking at him in surprise. "Just a memo. So that you know, I will always believe in you, wherever you are," he said. Emily put on the bracelet, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "Zach. I'll never forget you," she whispered. "Me too, Em. But this is not a farewell. This is just the beginning," he smiled, although his eyes were full of emotions. The next morning she went to New York. Zach stood at the station and watched the train slowly disappear into the distance. There was emptiness in his heart, but also pride in it. He knew that their story was not over. It's been a month since Emily left for New York. Zach tried to live on, but the feeling of emptiness did not leave him. Every night he sat on their hill, looking at the stars and thinking about it. At the same time, Emily plunged into a new life in New York. Her work received favorable reviews, but it seemed to her that something was missing in her soul. One evening, Zach received a message from Emily. Zach, I have good news for you. My painting made it to the final of the competition. But there is one but. The organizers want me to stay here for a year for an internship. What do you think about it? Zach reread the message several times. His heart was breaking. He wanted Emily to achieve everything she wanted, but at the same time, it meant that she would be even further away from him. He decided to answer simply. I'm proud of you, Em. You have to stay. This is your chance. But after sending the message, he felt that he had done something wrong. He couldn't tell her the truth, that her absence was tearing him apart. Meanwhile, a new figure appeared on the horizon in New York. Emily's colleague, named Oliver, showed a clear interest in her. He was tall, charismatic, and seemed to always know what to say. Emily didn't pay attention to him at first, but his persistence made her notice that he was a good conversationalist and had common interests with her. One evening, after the end of another exhibition, Oliver invited Emily to dinner. She hesitated, but eventually agreed. At dinner, he complimented her, calling her the most talented artist he had ever seen. "You deserve it all, Emily. And, to be honest, I'm very glad we met," he said, looking her straight in the eye. Emily was grateful for his words, but her thoughts were still about Zach. She couldn't help but compare his every gesture and every word with what was between her and Zach. Meanwhile, Zach, having remained in the town, learned from mutual acquaintances that Emily was increasingly spending time with this mysterious Oliver. One evening, he saw a photo on social media, Emily and Oliver together at the exhibition, both smiling and clearly happy. Something broke in Zach's chest. Maybe she doesn't need me anymore, he thought, closing his phone and barely holding back his anger and despair. But that wasn't the end. A few days later, Emily called him. Her voice was a little nervous, but she tried to sound familiar. "Zach, how are you?" "It's normal." "And you?" He answered briefly. "I'm fine. It's just, I wanted to tell you that everything is changing here. I met new people, I feel different here. It's scary, but also inspiring," she said, as if hinting at something more. Zach was silent. He felt his anger and sadness blending into one. "Great, Emily. I'm happy for you," he finally replied coldly. "Zach, are you angry?" she asked, feeling a change in his tone. "No, I'm just beginning to realize that maybe we live in different worlds. I'm glad you're doing well. And now, if you am sorry, I have things to do," he said, quickly ending the call. This conversation left a bitter residue in Emily's heart. She realized that their connection was beginning to weaken, and that was her fault. But at the same time, she could not ignore the new opportunities that opened up before her. Zach, meanwhile, decided to act. He realized that he could no longer just wait. He began planning a trip to New York without telling Emily about his intentions. He had only one desire: to understand if there was still a chance to get back what they lost. A week after that cold conversation, Zach was already on the train to New York. He was worried. What will he say when he sees her? Can you explain why you decided to come without warning? There were thousands of questions in his head, but one thing was clear: he had to see Emily. Arriving in New York, he felt small in a huge city. Everything seemed alien: noisy streets, lights of neon signs, people hurrying about their business. But that didn't stop him. He found the address of the gallery where Emily was supposed to work and went there. Approaching the building, Zach stopped to catch his breath. Inside, he saw Emily. She stood next to her painting, talking to Oliver. Her eyes shone, and laughter was heard in the air. Zach felt his heart tighten. It was the moment when he realized, maybe he was already late. Zach decided not to go inside. He stood on the sidewalk, watching her through the window. But suddenly Emily turned her head and saw him. Surprise appeared on her face, and then joy. She ran out into the street. "Zach? What are you doing here?" she exclaimed, barely believing her eyes. I just decided to see you," he said, hiding his hands in his pocket, trying to hide his excitement. "Why didn't you write that you were coming?" she asked, but there was no reproach in her voice, only surprise. "I wanted to make a surprise," he smiled, although there was a noticeable sadness in his eyes. Emily escorted him inside the gallery, but the atmosphere changed when they looked at Oliver. He came over and stretched out his hand. "You're probably Zach," Oliver said, nodding. "Emily told a lot about you." "Rejoiced to meet you," Zach replied dryly, barely touching Oliver's hand. The tension between them was palpable. Emily noticed this and tried to change the subject, but Oliver couldn't help it. Emily, I think we should discuss the details of your next work. We have a meeting with the curator in an hour, he reminded. I'll go out for a minute, she replied and gestured to Zach to go outside with her. As soon as the door closed behind them, Emily returned to Zach. Why are you acting like this? She asked, crossing her arms. How exactly? He looked directly at her, his voice sounded a little annoyed. If I didn't know you better, I would think you were jealous, she said, raising her eyebrows. What if so? He suddenly blurted out. His words took Emily by surprise. What? She whispered. Emily, don't you understand? I came here because I can't pretend that everything is normal anymore. I miss you, I miss us. And now I see you here with this. Oliver, and it just drives me crazy, his voice trembled with emotion. Emily was silent, not knowing what to say. If you are happy here, with him, then I will go. But if you feel a little bit the same as me, tell me. Zach looked at her, his eyes full of hope and pain. Emily looked away. Her thoughts fought with each other. Her career, a new life in New York, Oliver who was nearby. But Zach was Zach. Someone who knew her since childhood, who saw her real. Zach. I don't know, she finally said. Sees, he replied, taking a step back. Then, I guess, that's all. He turned and left, leaving Emily standing on the sidewalk, confused and emotionally devastated. But as soon as he disappeared around the corner, something changed in her heart. Emily stood on the sidewalk, watching Zach disappear around the corner. Her heart was pounding, but she couldn't bring herself to move. Her thoughts were torn between what she had built in New York and what she had left behind in her hometown. Oliver walked over to her, looking into her eyes with concern. Emily, are you okay? He asked, leaning closer. She slowly turned her head to him and nodded slightly. Yes, I'm fine, she lied, although her voice sounded shaky. But inside, everything was screaming and reminding her of the man she had just let go. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat for a long time at the window of her small Manhattan apartment, looking out at the lights of the big city, but her thoughts kept returning to the moment when Zach confessed his feelings to her. Suddenly, her phone rang. Emily jumped when she saw that it was her mom. Hi, Emily, her mom said warmly. I found some of your old drawings in the garage. Do you mind if I give them to charity? Drawings? Emily asked, her voice breaking a little with excitement. Can you send me a picture? A few minutes later, her phone rang again. It was photos of her children's artwork. One of the drawings caught her attention. It was a sketch of two people holding hands under a starry sky. She had drawn it after one of her adventures with Zach on the hill near her home. Emily suddenly realized that she had to act. She grabbed her jacket and ran outside. Emily rushed into the New York night, stopping a taxi. Her heart was pounding and her thoughts were chaotic. She knew Zach could be anywhere, but she had a feeling she had to find him. Please, to the train station, she told the driver as she got into the car. She felt like time had slowed down. Every second seemed like an eternity, and she couldn't shake the fear that Zach had already left. When the taxi stopped at the station, Emily jumped out without even waiting for the others. She ran to the main entrance, peering into the crowd of passengers, but couldn't find his face anywhere. Zach, she shouted, her voice breaking with exertion. People looked around, but he was gone. Emily felt her eyes fill with tears. But suddenly she noticed a familiar figure near the platform, sitting on a bench with his head bowed. It was him. Zach! Emily exclaimed, running up to him. He raised his head, looking at her in surprise. Emily? What are you doing here? He asked, standing up. I can't lose you, she answered, barely breathing from running so fast. Zach looked at her, not believing his ears. But you were happy there with him, he said, his voice filled with pain. Emily grabbed his arm, trying to stop him from speaking. That's not what I want. I can't imagine my life without you, Zach. I was blind, but now I see it. He looked at her, and something new appeared in his eyes, a mixture of hope and happiness. Are you sure? He asked quietly. More than ever, she answered, tears rolling down her cheeks. Zach hugged her, and in that moment the world ceased to exist for them. They stood there in the noisy station, but it was just the two of them. The next morning, Emily decided to leave New York and return home. But this time it was her decision, and she had no regrets. Her career as an artist could have gone anywhere, but her heart remained with Zach. They sat together on the hill where they first felt their lives were changing. Emily held his hand and looked up at the stars. You know, everything seems to be in place now, she said. Zach smiled and kissed her forehead. And I'll always be there for you, even if the stars say otherwise, he replied quietly. Their story was just beginning, but they knew that the best was ahead of them. The next few months were a real test of trust and adaptation to a new reality for Emily and Zach. Emily returned to her hometown, but her connection to the art world did not end. She continued to work remotely, sending her paintings to galleries in New York, receiving new invitations and even winning contests. Instead of separating them, this change only brought Emily and Zach closer. He became her biggest supporter and inspiration. Zach often helped her organize exhibitions in local cafes or libraries, turning them into cozy cultural events. One day, during another exhibition, Emily was approached by a man with a large briefcase. He introduced himself as an agent of a prestigious gallery from London. Your works are unique, he said with admiration. We would like to offer you an exhibition in our gallery. But it will require you to move to London for at least 6 months. Emily felt the ground slipping out from under her feet. This was a huge opportunity, but she knew that moving would put her relationship with Zach in question again. That evening, sitting on their favorite hill, Emily told Zach about the offer. London, he repeated quietly, trying to hide his emotions. I haven't decided anything yet, she replied, looking at him cautiously. Zach was silent for a few seconds, looking up at the starry sky. Emily, I know you need to do this. You've always dreamed of something more. And I can't be the one to hold you back, he said, though every word was hard for him to say. But I don't want to leave you, Zach, she said, barely holding back her tears. He took her hand and looked into her eyes. We've been through separation before. And, if this is real, we will go through it again. Emily accepted the proposal and left for London a month later. She missed Zach, but their daily calls, texts, and video chats helped keep them connected. However, her life changed even more in London. Exhibitions, interviews, new acquaintances. She had to face a lot of new challenges, and sometimes she felt lonely, even in the crowd. One evening, after a successful exhibition, Emily was sitting in her apartment, flipping through photos on her phone. She came across a picture taken on their hill and her heart sank. She realized that despite her successes, her true happiness remained at home with Zach. Emily decided to surprise him. She bought a ticket and, without telling him, headed back to their town. When she arrived, she saw Zach sitting in the yard of his house, playing his guitar. He looked a little older and more serious, but his eyes still glowed with the same warmth. Emily came closer, and he looked up. When he saw her, he froze, unable to believe his eyes. Emily, he asked, standing up. Hi, Zach, she said, unable to contain her smile. What are you doing here? He asked, still in shock. I realized I couldn't be happy without you. So I came back. Zach didn't say anything, just hugged her. It was the hug she had been waiting for so long. This time, they knew that their story didn't require distance or compromise. They decided to create their life together, supporting each other, wherever it would take them in the future.